The next thing on Clinical Assignment 1 says to make a sketch of the room layout, including the exposed and unexposed storage for your cassettes, if you have that in your room. The operator's protected area, which is behind me. This is a leaded glass window. Sometimes it doesn't need to be leaded glass, depending on the location of the operator's protected area, but indicate that on your sketch where the operator stands. Your cassette holder, any extra equipment that's in the room, but in particular the table, the x-ray tube, and then a lead apron holder is in this room. And we won't capture it in the video, but also we have where the entry to the room is, and that would be an indication of whether that door should be leaded or not, depending on the distance and the location of that door. The third thing on Clinical Assignment number 1 is to make a copy of any existing technique chart that you have, and again send it to me with your sketch so that I have an idea of what's available in your facility. If you do not have one, that's fine. Part of what we're going to be doing in the other clinical assignments is establishing parameters so I can figure out how to offer you a typical technique chart. Number 4 on this list says know your equipment. You need to go back to your room after you've completed session 1 to your facility and do the very things that we're doing throughout this session. Identify the items in the room. Find out if your equipment is high frequency, which would be most likely to be true if it was newer. And this equipment is new equipment. It may be a 3-phase, which is similar to high frequency. This is the x-ray tube. You know, the x-ray tube is inside this part of the contraption. This is actually the part that houses the x-ray tube. This here is the collimator. The beam restrictor lives here, and you need to know how to adjust the size of the beam using the collimator. Every tube has locks that have to be unlocked in order to manipulate the equipment, and in many cases that means depressing a button in order to move the tube up and down or sideways or to tilt it or whatever it is. Become familiar with your own equipment. Knowing how to move it smoothly and easily is part of your function. We're going to move this way too. This device here is an image intensifier that's used during fluoroscopy, and I mentioned earlier that most limited operators don't participate in that, but you should know what it is, what it's for. It has a lead apron, if you will, to protect the person operating the equipment during the exam. Handle the cassettes in your facility. Find out what kinds of cassettes and what sizes you have. These are 400 speed, which is very typical these days of the kinds of cassette and screens that would be present in any facility. This is a 9.5 by 9.5, which is not common for most facilities. Common ones are 14 by 17, 11 by 14, 10 by 12, and then 8 by 10. But this facility uses their 9.5 by 9.5 for 2 different applications and have opted not to have 8 by 10s. Here's our table. This is our tray that holds the cassette. We put it in like this, and you remember from the other, or will learn if you haven't already gone through those other materials, that the grid is right underneath the table just above the cassette. So sometimes we use words like bucky and grid interchangeably, but this is the tray that holds the cassette. The whole device is usually referred to as the bucky. When you place the tray all the way in with the film on it and then make your exposure, the grid that's underneath the table will oscillate. It will move back and forth like this, and that will blur out those grid lines that help the quality of the image. The presence of them helps the quality of the image. So find out how to open your bucky and place your cassette inside of or on the tray. Handle the cassettes, feel them. Take them to the dark room, turn the lights off, and unload and load them in the dark so you know how to work your cassettes. Cassettes are all different in terms of how they open and close, so you need to be familiar with the ones you've got in order to do it in the dark. Okay, we're grabbing a 14 by 17 cassette in order to demonstrate how this particular upright film holder works. Place the film in position, the film inside the cassette in position, and it works just like the table in this case, sliding the tray in and knowing that the grid, which has a movable grid, which is called a Bucky, is right there underneath the outside and before you get to the film. Sometimes your upright film holder won't have a movable grid, it will just have a grid. And then in that case it's a fine line grid, and you may see grid lines on that image. Okay, one of the things that would be very helpful for you to learn is how your equipment sounds. So you're going to set a technique on your control panel. Makes no difference really what it is. 70 kV, 100 mA, half a second, some kind of a long time, so that you have time to hear the changes that we're going to make. You notice I've set up 80 kV, 100 mA, 100 MAS, which tells me that my exposure time is going to be at least a second. And I'm going to make the exposure. And what I want you to hear is, as I push the ready button, you should notice the rotor running. You need to know what that sounds like in your environment. You are not making an exposure when you push the ready button. You're just getting the machine ready for the exposure. But it has its own unique sound, and it indicates for you when you now can make an exposure. Look on this control panel up here. When I push ready, and then it comes on, it tells me the machine is now ready to give me the amount of X-ray that I have selected. The other thing that you're going to do is push your ready. Here it comes to full speed, and then when you push your exposure button, I want you to notice the length of the exposure time. And you notice two things. We had an indicator of X-ray on, and it stayed there until the exposure was over. It's the timer that stops the exposure. So don't be afraid to keep your finger on the button. You push ready. You have it come up to speed here. And now you're going to look for the indicator light that says you're making an exposure. And now you see my finger, it's still on the button. But there's no more X-rays coming out because the timer stopped the exposure. You don't have to be afraid of it. The only thing you have to be afraid of is letting your finger up too quickly, because then you can make the exposure too short. If you push ready and you push X-ray and you're afraid of it, as many people are as they begin, you've shortened the exposure and your film will be underexposed. One other quick thing. Watch what happens when I actually lower the MAS value to, say, 10, a tenth of the previous one. What you should hear is a much shorter exposure, and you're going to develop an instinct about that as you make your exposures. Now listen for that. How quick that was. And you begin to recognize it as another way of validating that what you just did was good.